The other day, my son Alex visited from college. It's his sophomore year, and up then he'd been planning to go into computer science like me. That's when he told me he wanted to sit down and talk man to man. So even though he's not quite 21, I poured him a bit of my good scotch and we sat down in my study. "I'm switching to environmental science," he blurted out after a few seconds. "I know that's not what you want, but I think it's what I need to do. If you feel like I'm letting you down, I totally understand. If you want to stop paying my tuition, I get that too. It's just..." I held up my hand. "It's fine," I said. "Don't say you're sorry. If anything, I should be apologizing for making you think I'd be upset." I motioned over to a poster that had been hanging on my wall for a few decades, an old black and white photo of William Carlos Williams with a quote beneath that read, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." He nodded like he understood. The thing with the quote was that it couldn't really sink in until you'd lived a bit. 20 years just wasn't long enough to see the way life grinds your friends to dust. Sure, Alex had experienced the sharp pains of a few sudden losses, but he couldn't truly know the truth of entropy yet, or the desperation of decades slowly watching your soul leak out. "I'm going to tell you a story now," I said. "It's a true story. You can believe it or not. That's up to you." I found my hand was shaking a little as I set my glass of scotch down on the table. I had never told anyone the story, not even my wife. It lived in a dark corner of my mind that I preferred not to visit. But it seemed important that I tell Alex now. I began to tell Alex the story. "When I was a little older than you, my sister Nina and I took a spring break road trip, driving back from LA all the way home to New Mexico. I was a couple years out of school, and she was a senior, majoring in poetry. Personally, I thought the whole thing was a joke, but I was young, a little bit sexist. I figured if she couldn't get a job with a poetry degree, she'd end up getting married and just being a mom. Nothing wrong with that. As for me, I had a little bit of change in my pocket for the first time in my life. Money was basically all I thought about. Even if I was thinking about girls, it was about how I'd find a better, hotter one if I had more cash. Like I said, I was young and stupid. It was how I thought back then. "You should listen to this album," said Nina. She popped a Smith CD into the player and cranked up the volume. "It's a little loud," I said. "It's poetry. I'm trying to drive." She turned it down a hair and then sang along as the music blasted. To be honest, I hated it. The whole album seemed equal parts pretentious and whiny. Honestly, it made me worry my sister was going to end up with a guy like the singer, penniless and way too in touch with his emotions. "You got a plan for after school's done?" I asked. "I think I need a break," she said. "I've got a friend who's going backpacking through South America. She might stop and work at a hotel or something, maybe learn Spanish as she goes. I'm thinking of going with her. Probably safer, 2 girls together." "And then what?" "Hard to say," she said. "I guess I'll have a lot of time to think about it while we're traveling." That's not a plan. We argued like that, back and forth as we drove east. At some point, the sun fell behind us and everything got dark. Even though it was night, it was still 100 degrees outside. I kept checking my gauges, making sure we didn't overheat. We were a long stretch of the 10 between Tucson and El Paso, a million miles from any real civilization. Suddenly, I saw something dart across the freeway up ahead. At first I thought it was a deer, but it was too small. I slammed on the brakes, almost skidding off the road. I came to a stop maybe 20 feet in front of the figure, only now realizing it was a little girl. She was maybe 8 or 9 and wearing an old-fashioned dress, dripping wet. "Stay in the car," I told Nina. "I'll see what's going on." She put a hand on my wrist. "Don't," she said. "There's no one out here for miles. She's going to need help." In the meantime, the little girl stared in at us from in front of the car. Her color was all washed out from my brights, but it didn't seem to bother her eyes. It was like she was staring right through us, unblinking. I stepped outside and walked up to the girl. She was shivering despite the heat, and she smelled of salt, like she just stepped out of the ocean, though it was 100 miles away. "Do you need help?" I asked. For some reason, I found myself keeping my distance, keeping the car door between us. "Sing me a song," she said quietly. "I've been awake ever so long. I can't sleep without my lullaby." "I can get you to the next town," I said. "Or do you have a house out here nearby? Parents around?" She smiled and shook her head. "You're very kind," she said. "But I don't want any of those things. Just a song, please. It doesn't have to be a lullaby, if you don't know one. Any song will do. Just sing to her," whispered Nina from inside the car. "And then let's go." The little girl took a step toward me. As she did, I saw that she left wet footprints on the hot freeway behind her. Wet lines of mucus were running down her nose, further wetting her too white skin. "It's very quiet in the water," she said. "Much too quiet. None of the fish have anything to say. Sing me a song. Maybe a new song. I hear there are so many new songs these days, but no one sings to me." I racked my brain. I'd listened to a few Pink Floyd albums in high school, but not like my friends who could sing along to every lyric. It had just never seemed that interesting to me. Music was a waste of time. The girl took another step toward me. When she smiled, she opened her mouth wide, and I saw that it was full of water and wet seaweed. The salty smell hit much harder now. I could practically hear the ocean in her rattling breath. "Happy birthday to you," I started singing, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. "Happy? Not that one," she said, her smile suddenly gone. "No more birthdays. Never again. It's the only one I know," I said. She took another step, reaching the other side of the car door. And then with one tiny finger she flicked the window glass, and it shattered, falling to bits at my feet. I tried to take a step back and fell to the ground. I scrambled back and felt a pain in my palm as glass sliced into it. At the smell of blood, the girl's eyes lit up. She pushed at the car door, and her slightest touch slammed it shut. She stood over me, steam coming off her in the hot night air, licking her lips. "I wish you'd had a song to sing me," she said. "I might have loved it. I would have sung it all the way home, every step back to the ocean." She reached forward with two hands, placing them on either side of my head. She began to press, and the pressure was insane, like nothing I'd ever felt, the way the ocean must press in at you when you're 1,000 feet deep. And just then, I heard a voice singing. "I am the sun. And the air. Of a shyness that is criminally vulgar. I am the sun and air. Of nothing in particular." Nina was standing behind me, singing her stupid Smith's song into the hot night air. As she did, the girl stood and began to dance. When the verse repeated, she mouthed the words quietly to herself. Soon, she was twirling and smiling, shaking her wet hair, filing salt water into the night. And then, as Nina sang the last word, the girl bowed and walked off into the darkness. I stood up and began to pick the glass from my hand. After a few minutes, I realized I was crying. And then Nina came and hugged me tight. I poured myself another glass of scotch, then filled up Alex's cup too. "I ended up paying for the trip Nina wanted to take down south," I said. "When she came back, she ended up going to grad school in New Jersey. On my 30th birthday, she sent me that poster, and I've had it on my wall ever since." Of course, by then I'd already started to change the way I approached my life. Still, it was a good reminder. Alex finished his drink and looked up at me, his eyes large. He looked sick. "I've seen her too," he said quietly. "When I was a kid. Sometimes, I'd wake up at night, and I'd look out the window, and I'd see her there. I still remember the salt smell. And I'd scream and I'd scream and I'd scream for you. And you always came. You always ran in, and you never left without singing me a song. By the time you stopped singing, she was always gone."
Heard it my first night in the new house. Someone walking down the street and snapping their fingers with both hands in the middle of the night. Shit. I had forgotten to close my curtains. Earlier that day, an older couple came over with a saran-wrapped plate of muffins and a warning. They told me that every night at 3 a.m., someone walks outside the house and snaps his fingers. They said that I should never, under any circumstances, look at the man. If I did, I would sorely regret it. When I asked them what happened if you looked at him, they didn't say a word. Instead, they just looked at each other, and the husband shook his head. Now I was in my room and the snapping man was on his way. I was just about to get out of bed and shut the curtains when suddenly the next snap came from right outside the bedroom window. I let out a startled cry. The house was a good 20 feet from the public sidewalk and separated by a garden gate and then a row of bushes. Somehow he had cleared that distance in less than a second. I covered my face with the pillow and curled up into a ball. A whispered prayer escaped my lips, and I hoped that God was stronger than whatever was outside. The thing started walking back and forth, going just past my house each time. His snapping started out slow and rhythmic but got faster and faster each time until it reached a feverish speed. As they sped up, the snaps grew louder, much louder than any sound a human snap could make, to the point that they rattled the window glass in its pain and drowned out every other sound. I began to shake, and shouted for Jesus to protect me. Part of me wanted desperately to jump out of bed and face whatever monster was outside, but I thought back to my neighbor's visit and resisted the urge. It wasn't even their warning that persuaded me, it was the look on their faces when I asked what happened to those who chose to look. They both turned white as ghosts, like the blood had been drained from their heads, and their faces twisted in nauseating fear at the memory of neighbors who hadn't heeded their warnings. It was the kind of instant animal reaction that you cannot hide even when you try, so I knew that whatever happened to those who looked, it had to be terrifying. Even so, it was difficult to lie there defenseless in bed while the snaps grew so loud that I thought my eardrums might burst. I tried stuffing the corners of my pillow down my ears but it did nothing to quiet the incessant roar. Then there was silence. The noise stopped so suddenly that it was almost startling. From outside, a gravely reptilian voice said, not in a whisper but in a low and quiet tone. "Good night." Footsteps went away from the window and back up the road in the direction they came. It wasn't until the footsteps trailed off that I noticed the sound of someone crying. After a moment, I realized it was me. I was crying, no, sobbing uncontrollably. The experience had been absolutely terrible and frightening in a way I cannot put into words. The worst part was that the louder the snaps got, the more I wanted to look at who was doing them. It wasn't just a morbid curiosity, it was almost as if the sound was beckoning me, like an audible angler fish was inviting me into its razor-filled jaws. I got up without opening my eyes and shut the window curtains. It took 4 more hours to fall asleep, and even then only because the sun was starting to rise and the world felt safe again. After a while I developed certain strategies for coping with my nightly visitor. At first I tried putting earplugs in before going to bed, but that didn't do anything to cover up the sound of the snapping. Worse still, the "goodbye" at the end was always as clear as if I had my ear up against the wall. I asked around, and some people in the neighborhood let me know that you could help drown out the noise by leaving a fan on through the night. It sounded dumb at first, but I was desperate enough to try anything at that point and, sure enough, it worked. The snapping was still loud, but endurable, and after a week I was sleeping through the whole thing. In order to make sure I never accidentally looked out the window, I tied the curtains shut and put a box over the sill for an added layer of protection. I also constructed a wall of cardboard around the corner of my bed closest to the window so that if I happened to look over there in the middle of the night and the box had in some way fallen off and the curtains were somehow open, I still wouldn't see him. I even put tripwire in front of the window so that if I were to try and unblock the window in my sleep I would fall over and wake up. I know, it's a lot of precautionary stuff, but what would you do in my situation? I was determined to not be like one of those dumbasses in scary movies who know there's an imminent threat and just keeps going about things as usual, and when the monster gets them everyone in the audience thinks I told you so. Fuck that. Once I fine-tuned my nighttime defense strategies, my life started getting back to normal. I joined a book club, settled into my new job, and even became friends with a couple coworkers. One was a goofy guy named Tyler who's stupid in a fun-to-be-around kind of way, and the other was a beautiful girl I was flirting with named Amanda. Everything was going great until I had the dumb idea to invite both of them over for a little party at my place. We started off with board games, pizza, and beer, then more beer, then some pizza, and finally some more beer. At one point Tyler got up to use the pisser, as he put it, and I seized the opportunity to capitalize on the liquid courage I had in my system and make a move on Amanda. I was just building up to it when Tyler shouted out, "What the fuck is this stuff in your room?" I froze. I had gone so long without waking up at 3 a.m. that I had half forgotten about the thing that roamed the neighborhood. I looked down at my watch. 2:55. Shit. I had let time get away from me. I got up and ran into my bedroom, and Amanda followed me. "Don't touch it. Get away from the window," I shouted at Tyler, who was peeling back the box on the windowsill. He and Amanda stared at me with their mouths gaping open, and I knew I had to explain myself. I told them all about the thing that comes by every night at 3 a.m. and how it was incredibly dangerous to look at him. I expected them to think I was crazy, but that wasn't exactly how they reacted. "Whoa," Tyler gasped. "So, like, your neighborhood is haunted?" "Well, yeah, I guess technically. But it's not a huge deal as long as you stay away from that window," I said. "So, like, you've never even seen the guy that does this?" he asked me. I shook my head. "How do you know it isn't just some random loser playing a prank?" "Trust me, if you heard it you would know that it isn't anything human," I told him. He looked at me with a flash of excitement. "What time is it?" he asked. I checked my watch again. 2:58, I stuttered, and then looked at him in terror. I did not want them to witness the snapping. For some reason it just felt dangerous to have them around. I worried something unexpected would happen, something out of my control, like Amanda tripping and accidentally ripping down the box on the window. Or Tyler being Tyler and trying to drunk fight the monster. I mean, they were two highly intoxicated young adults, and we were at what shared a passing resemblance to a party. I was basically playing with fire inside a fuel tank. "We need to get out of here. Let's go back into the living room, come on." I blurted and tried to herd the two out of my room, but Tyler wouldn't budge. "No fucking way, man. Now that we're here, I want to hear this thing. I'm staying." I could tell he meant it, and I didn't know what I could do to convince him to leave. Before I could even think of something else to say, I heard it. The snaps were starting from down the street. "He's coming," I said, mostly to myself. Tyler and Amanda fell silent and strained to listen for the sound of his arrival. "I don't hear dash," Amanda started to say, but she was cut off by the sudden sound of snapping that came from right outside the window. I groaned. He was here. Tyler, who was facing the window, fell backwards onto the floor. "Holy shit," he giggled. "It's real." I didn't like the look I saw on Tyler's face. He was eyeing the window up and down like it was a roller coaster he was about to ride, a plunge into adventure that he was ready to take. "Come over here, Tyler. It's not safe by the window," I said, but my words were lost on him. "Tyler, get over here," Amanda yelled. The snapping started to get louder, and Tyler's visage changed from excited to afraid. However, that glimmer of adventure still shone in his eye. "Why can't we look at him again?" Tyler shouted over the growing noise. He started to move, hesitantly, towards the rattling window. I tried to shout back an answer, but the snapping was already deafening and it drowned out any sound of my voice. "Where is that fan?" I looked around desperately for the fan that could quiet the all-consuming noise. I could have sworn I left it in its usual place. Amanda covered her ears and crouched down to her knees. I could tell by her face that she was crying. For a second I bent down to comfort her, and when I looked up I just barely caught Tyler's mouth moving. I'm not the best lip reader, but I could tell he said something like, "I think I'm going to open the window," as he reached to pull the box off the window sill. I sprang up from the floor across the room towards him and shouted with all my might for him to stop, but it was too late. Just as I was about to reach him, Tyler undid the curtains and he laid eyes on the terrible thing outside. I shielded my own eyes with my elbow just in time, but that didn't stop me from hearing Tyler's screams. Because as soon as Tyler opened the curtains, the snapping stopped. The thing outside the window let out a deep, animal moan of pleasure and then all we could hear was a mortifying, blood-curdling wail. It came from Tyler, and it sounded like a mix between a terrible human shriek and the squeal of a pig being slaughtered. I felt bad for him, but at the same time I didn't know what I could do to help without putting myself in danger. Thankfully, the screaming soon subsided and after a few seconds of silence I decided to open my eyes. Tyler was sitting in the corner, slumped over like a drunk. His mouth was turned up in a slight smile and drool poured out of the corner. "Tyler," I began to talk to him. He looked over when I said his name, and I saw that his eyeballs were all white. They didn't pupils or irises, not even any veins. They were just pure white like two cue balls stuck in his skull. He smiled wider. "Tyler, are you, all right?" I asked. "I'm fine," he said dryly as he stood up. I looked at the watcher, and he has helped me truly see. He took a step toward us. "I think you two should look, I promise you won't regret it." He took another step forward and reached a hand out in our direction. "Just take a quick peek. I won't tell anyone." At that moment, a dull thud came from the window. Tyler went on talking and staggering towards us. I put a protective arm out in front of Amanda, in a feeble attempt at shielding her from whatever terribleness had entered the body of our friend. "You should take a look, it's not so bad. It's not like what they've told you." There was another thud against the window. It sounded like something was pounding on the glass. "I promise, I wouldn't lie to friends," Tyler said. Thud. "Do I look like I'm hurt?" I wanted to answer that he did look hurt, but I knew it wouldn't do much. There was something very wrong with him. Looking out the window had changed him. "Tyler, what is that thing doing?" I asked him tentatively as I took a cautious step backward. Thud. "Who?" Tyler asked me. "That thing outside." "Oh, he's banging his head on the glass. He says that once someone looks at him, he's allowed to come in." As he said those words, there was another thud and the glass made a cracking noise. I turned around to look at Amanda, and said the last words I would ever speak to her. "Get out, now." She took off running and I followed close after. Behind us, I heard Tyler call out, this time in his normal voice as if the real Tyler had fought his way out of the prison that was his mind. "Wait, take me with you. I can't see." I paused and almost turned back, but that was when the window shattered and I knew that going back for him meant certain doom for us both. It was hard to leave my friend behind like that, but I told myself there was nothing I could do. It would have been like one drowning person trying to save another. So I took off. By the time I got through the front door, Amanda was already out of sight. Her car wasn't in the driveway, so I assumed she made it to safety. My car was in the garage and the keys were up in my room, so I ran away on foot. New screams and the sounds of tearing flesh echoed out into the night as I crossed the lawn and scampered down the sidewalk. There was so much adrenaline in my system that running was not difficult, even though I was severely out of shape. I ran until my frantic legs carried me to a public place, a fast food restaurant that I had never noticed before. Thank God it was open. I burst inside and collapsed onto the sticky tile floor where a worker had just mopped. He looked slightly annoyed, but not in the least bit shocked. I guess the graveyard staff at a fast food place see a lot of crazy shit. As soon as I regained my breath, I pulled out my phone and called 911. I told the operator that someone had broken in and attacked my friend. I hoped there was still a chance for Tyler, but in my gut I knew that it was over for him. The operator asked where I lived, and when I gave her the address her tone of voice completely changed. "Did he look out the window?" she asked. I guess emergency services was already aware of the thing that wandered the neighborhood. "Yeah, he did." I sniffled. "Well, I'm sorry sir, but there's nothing we can do for your friend. We will try to recuperate most of your belongings in the morning, but you cannot go back to that house. Do you have somewhere else you can stay?" she asked. I was speechless. There was nothing they could do. What was that thing that went snapping outside my window every night, and how was it so terrifying that even 911 wouldn't mess with it? Eventually I lied to her and said I could stay at a relative's house, but truthfully I had nowhere to go. My only two friends in the area were Tyler and Amanda, one of whom was literally in the belly of the beast and the other wasn't answering my calls. I bought a cheeseburger and a soda and spent the rest of the night lying in a booth at that fast food place. Now I live in a new city, in a new neighborhood. I have a good job and am even making a few friends at work. Things are going great, but I'm starting to get a little worried. My next-door neighbors just called and said that they want to come over to discuss some community guidelines. They said it has something to do with locking your doors every time there's a full moon. I swear, I can't take this stuff anymore. Why can't I just find a decent place to live? I was only 19 when I took that odd job, the one that still haunts my nightmares. My name is Justin, and at the time, I was desperate for work. The summer before college was winding down, and I wanted to save up some extra cash before diving headfirst into the world of higher education. I had spent weeks scouring the internet for any opportunity that would pay decently, but my searches often came up empty. That is, until I stumbled upon that eerie ad. Night security monitor needed, the headline read, and the description was simple: watch a live security camera feed from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. $25 an hour. It seemed too good to be true, but the prospect of making that much money for doing something so easy was too enticing to pass up. I immediately reached out to the contact email provided, and within a few hours, I received a response from someone named Daniel. "Hi Justin, thank you for your interest in our night security monitor position. We would like to invite you for an interview at our office. Can you come by tomorrow at 3 p.m.? Please let me know. Regards, Daniel." I agreed to the interview and received the address of their office, located in a part of town I was not too familiar with. The following day, I dressed in my most professional attire and headed out to the interview, trying to calm my nerves. As I approached the building, I could see that it was old and worn down, with a sign above the entrance that read, "Memento Security Solutions." The windows were covered in a thick layer of grime, obscuring the view inside. The entrance door creaked as I pushed it open, and the air inside was stale and musty. I was greeted by a receptionist who seemed to be in her late 40s. She had a gaunt face and her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked me up and down, her expression devoid of any warmth. "You must be Justin. Daniel is expecting you. Go down the hall and take a left. It's the last door on the right." I thanked her and followed her instructions. The hallway was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The carpet beneath my feet was threadbare and stained. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside, reminding myself of the money I could make if I got the job. As I reached the door the receptionist had mentioned, I took a deep breath and knocked. A muffled voice called out for me to enter. I opened the door and found myself in a small, cluttered office. A man sat behind a desk, his face hidden behind a large computer monitor. He motioned for me to sit down in a chair across from him. "Justin, right?" "I'm Daniel," he said, his voice gravelly and cold. "I don't have much time, so I'll be brief. Your job will be to monitor a live security feed from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. Your sole responsibility is to watch the room and report anything unusual to me immediately. Understood?" I nodded, feeling somewhat confused. What exactly am I looking for? What's in the room? Daniel sighed, as if my questions were an inconvenience. "You'll see when you start your shift. Just keep an eye on the room and report anything out of the ordinary. That's all you need to know." Despite the strange circumstances, I agreed to take the job. Daniel handed me a small card with a phone number and an access code written on it. He explained that I would need to call the number and enter the code to be connected to the live feed. I asked if I could see the room in person, but he brushed off my question, stating that it wasn't necessary for me to be physically present. He then told me that my first shift would start that very night. With a mix of apprehension and curiosity, I left the office and headed home, eager to begin my new job. As 11 p.m. approached, I set up my laptop on my desk and dialed the phone number Daniel had given me. After entering the access code, I was greeted by a low-quality video feed of a small, dark room. The walls appeared to be made of old, crumbling brick, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. In the center of the room stood a lone wooden chair, illuminated by a single, dim ceiling light that cast eerie shadows on the walls. I couldn't help but shudder as I stared at the image on my screen. For the first couple of hours, nothing happened. The room remained empty and silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the ceiling light. As the night wore on, my eyes grew heavy, and I struggled to stay awake. I began to question the purpose of this job and why I was being paid so much to watch an empty room. Around 2 a.m., something changed. The shadows cast by the ceiling light seemed to shift and elongate, taking on unnatural shapes that defied explanation. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was imagining things, but when I opened them again, the shadows remained distorted. I felt a chill run down my spine as I continued to watch, unable to tear my gaze away. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows returned to their normal state. I blinked, unsure if I had imagined the whole thing or if something truly strange had occurred. I decided to call Daniel and report the incident, as he had instructed me to do. As soon as I mentioned the shifting shadows, I could hear the tension in his voice. "Stay on the line and keep watching. Don't take your eyes off the room. I'll be there as soon as I can," he said before hanging up. I was left feeling both relieved and terrified. At least I knew I wasn't imagining things, but what had I just witnessed? I stared intently at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't long before the shadows began to change again, this time twisting into grotesque, humanoid shapes. They seemed to crawl along the walls, converging on the wooden chair in the center of the room. As I watched in horror, the shadows began to solidify, taking on a more corporeal form. Before I knew it, a figure materialized in the chair, its body composed of darkness and shadow. Its eyes, two glowing orbs of malevolent light, locked onto the camera, and I felt as if it were staring directly into my soul. The air around me grew cold, and I struggled to breathe, my heart racing with terror. Suddenly, there was a knock at my door. I tore my eyes away from the screen for a moment, only to find Daniel standing in my doorway, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "We need to shut it down, now," he yelled, rushing over to my laptop and frantically searching for a way to disconnect the feed. As he did, the figure in the chair began to move, its shadowy form stretching and twisting as it reached out towards the camera. The screen filled with darkness, and just as the figure's hand seemed about to break through the screen, Daniel managed to cut the feed. We sat in silence, our breaths ragged and our hearts pounding. Daniel finally broke the silence. "You were never supposed to see that. Whatever you do, don't tell anyone about what you just saw. You don't know what you're dealing with," and neither do I. What was that thing? I asked, my voice shaking. I don't know, Daniel admitted, his eyes still wide with terror. But it's dangerous, and it's not something anyone should ever witness. I should have never hired you for this job. I thought I could contain it, but I was wrong. He paused for a moment, seemingly trying to collect his thoughts. You're done here, Justin. I'll pay you for the time you worked, but you can't come back. It's too dangerous. As I accepted the cash he handed me, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and dread. I had narrowly escaped something horrifying, but now I was left with the knowledge that such a malevolent entity existed, and it was trapped within that dark room. And though I had been spared, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now connected to it in some way, and that I would never be truly free of its influence. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me, but it proved impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark figure in the chair, its eyes burning into me. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford, and my life began to unravel. I became obsessed with finding answers, with understanding what I had witnessed. But the more I dug, the more questions I had. What was that thing? Why was it trapped in that room? And why had Daniel hired me to watch it? As weeks turned to months, my search for answers consumed me. I lost touch with friends and family, my grades in college plummeted, and I was eventually forced to drop out. I spent my days scouring the internet, visiting libraries, and even consulting with experts in the fields of the paranormal and the occult. But no matter where I turned, I found only dead ends and more questions. Eventually, my obsession led me to a small, forgotten town in the heart of the country, where whispers of a similar entity had been recorded decades prior. But what I found there only deepened the mystery and left me with an even greater sense of dread. I now wander the world, searching for answers and trying to piece together the fragments of the nightmare that has become my life. But as the years pass and the darkness within me grows, I can't help but wonder if I will ever find the truth or if I am doomed to be haunted by that dark room and the figure that lurks within it for the rest of my days. And so, I continue my search, driven by a desperate need to understand the horror that has consumed me. I can only hope that one day I will find the answers I seek, and in doing so, find some measure of peace. Until then, I remain trapped in the shadow of that terrible room, my life a living nightmare from which I cannot awaken. I took the midnight train from the city to the small town where I lived. I never imagined that it would become a nightmarish ordeal that would scar me for life. The train was nearly empty, just the way I liked it. I boarded carriage 13, took a seat by the window, and closed my eyes, ready to get some rest. Soon after, I heard the shuffling of feet and the opening and closing of the carriage door. 5 more passengers had entered the carriage. I glanced at them, unconcerned, as they took their seats. A sudden lurch of the train jolted me from my thoughts. It seemed like we had picked up speed, and the faint light that filtered through the windows gradually faded to darkness. I looked out, but all I could see was a black void surrounding the train. The darkness had triggered something, the passengers began to share their lives. I learned that Emma's eerie landscapes were inspired by the loss of her younger brother, who had drowned in a lake when she was a child. Coincidentally, Tom, her boyfriend, had been present at the lake that day, but he didn't remember Emma. He was there with another girl, who would later become the mother of his son. That son was now a ward of the state due to Tom's struggle with alcoholism, which was fueled by his guilt over cheating on Emma with Lily. Sarah, the woman who despised Tom for his betrayal of her sister, had her own demons to battle. After her mother's death, she became obsessed with finding the person responsible for the hit-and-run. She spent years of her life tracking down leads and using her position as a private investigator to gather information. The search consumed her, poisoning her relationships and forcing her to confront the darkest parts of herself. Dave, the man responsible for the accident, was a widower who had lost his wife to cancer. In his grief, he had turned to the bottle, culminating in the drunken night that led to the hit and run. Racked with guilt and afraid of the consequences, he'd kept his secret hidden for years, haunted by the lives he had destroyed. Lastly, there was Jane, a nurse who had been the first responder at the scene of the accident that killed Sarah's mother. She carried the weight of that night with her, blaming herself for not being able to save the woman's life. In a cruel twist of fate, she had also been the nurse who cared for Dave's dying wife, never knowing the connection between them. Our lives were a tangled web of tragedies, loves, and secrets, all leading us to this moment, bound together in carriage 13. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It was unnerving, this revelation that we were entangled by fate. But as the darkness pressed in, we had to focus on survival, even as our shared past threatened to tear us apart. We realized that if we wanted to survive, we had to stick together. But as the train thundered through the abyss, tensions grew. The darkness fed on our fears and insecurities, amplifying them. It whispered terrible truths, bringing long-buried emotions to the surface. It played on our guilt, our regrets, and the fragile threads of connection that held us together. Soon, we were at each other's throats. Whispers filled the air, voices that sounded eerily like our own, recounting our deepest shames and failures. Emma could hear her brother's voice, calling to her from the depths of the lake where he drowned. Tom was taunted with images of his son, crying for his absent father, while Sarah was tortured with the feeling of her mother's blood on her hands. Jane found herself reliving the moment she couldn't save Sarah's mother, the woman's pleading eyes etched into her memory. Dave was forced to confront the ghost of his wife, who accused him of abandoning her in her time of need and reminded him of the blood on his hands from the hit and run. The atmosphere in the carriage grew thick with fear, and our suspicions of one another intensified. The darkness fed on our disintegrating trust, urging us to turn against each other. At first, we tried to resist its influence, huddling together in the dim light, reminding ourselves of our shared humanity. But the strain began to show. Emma lashed out at Tom, accusing him of never truly loving her. Sarah, tormented by her mother's death, fixated on Dave, her anger boiling over. Jane, overwhelmed by the guilt of the lives she couldn't save, retreated into herself, withdrawing from the others. And I felt my own demons clawing at the edges of my mind. The darkness reminded me of the reason I had been on that midnight train, a failed marriage, a lost job, and the overwhelming feeling that I was slipping into a bottomless abyss, much like the one that now surrounded us. As our unity crumbled, we began to see each other not as allies, but as enemies to be conquered. The darkness twisted our bonds, turning love into resentment and friendship into betrayal. We fought with increasing ferocity, the violent outbursts providing fuel for the abyss to further manipulate us, ensuring that our chances of survival grew ever slimmer. The breaking point came when it was revealed that Dave, a quiet and unassuming man in his 40s, was the drunk driver responsible for the accident that killed Sarah and Lily's mother years ago. He had fled the scene, never coming forward to face the consequences. The guilt of his actions had festered within him, poisoning his very soul. That revelation shattered any semblance of unity we had. The air in the carriage grew thick with tension as the full weight of Dave's crime bore down on us. Sarah's face twisted in rage as she lunged at him, her hands finding his throat. The others, their own demons gnawing at their sanity, chose sides in the escalating conflict. Tom, Emma, and I tried to break them apart, but it was useless. The darkness had driven them mad, and they fought with a ferocity born of raw fear and desperation. Blood began to stain the floor as the violence escalated. Sarah managed to grab a sharp piece of twisted metal from the warped interior of the carriage and drove it into Dave's stomach. His agonized screams echoed through the carriage, barely audible over the cacophony of metal and the wind rushing outside. Blood poured from his wound as he crumpled to the ground. Terrified and disgusted, I stumbled backward, distancing myself from the others. I watched in horror as Tom, overwhelmed by his own guilt, turned on Emma. She sobbed as she tried to fight him off, begging him to remember their love, but his face was contorted with madness. His hands gripped her neck tightly as she struggled for breath. I knew I had to do something, so I threw myself at Tom, desperately trying to pry his fingers from Emma's throat. But my strength was no match for the darkness that fueled him. Emma's face turned a sickening shade of blue before she went limp in Tom's grasp. He released her lifeless body, only to turn his mad gaze on me. I backed away, but the darkness had other plans. It closed in, swallowing both Tom and Emma's bodies whole, leaving me alone in the warped and twisted carriage. In the end, it was just me and the abyss. My heart raced as I stood alone in the contorted carriage, its twisted metal screeching in protest. The darkness whispered my name, coaxing me to step into the void. As the darkness whispered, visions of my own tragic past manifested before me. It showed me the times I'd hurt people I loved, the choices I'd made that led to the deaths of my friends, and all the selfish moments in my life. The abyss was trying to break me, to make me feel powerless and submit to its dark embrace. But I refused to give in. The whispers turned to screams, the visions became more vivid and relentless, but I wouldn't let it take me. I stumbled to the emergency door and wrenched it open. The suction of the darkness threatened to drag me into its clutches, but I held on, fueled by sheer desperation. The darkness lashed out in fury, tendrils of inky blackness snaking around my arms and legs, trying to pull me into its depths. It was as if the abyss had taken on a malevolent will of its own, hell-bent on devouring me. My muscles ached and my grip began to falter. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer, but I refused to give up. With a final surge of determination, I reached out with my free hand and grabbed onto the carriage railing, anchoring myself against the darkness's relentless assault. In that moment, it was as if I had unlocked some hidden reservoir of strength within myself. The darkness began to waver, its tendrils loosening their grip on me. I fought back with all my might, pushing the darkness away. And then, suddenly, the darkness receded. The train burst back into the normal world, its speed slowing as it pulled into a station. I fell onto the platform, gasping for air, my body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. As I lay there, the station's lights flickering overhead, I knew that I had survived the abyss, but not without cost. I was the last one standing, but I was now forever haunted by the darkness and the lives that had been lost within its grasp. My family owns a cabin in the woods in Surrey, which is just south of London in England. They bought it when I was 4. My parents loved going there. After a while, the teenager in me got bored of it, so I stopped coming with them. My dad died recently. I loved him dearly. My parents divorced shortly after I left for uni. I haven't spoken to my mum in a long time. One time I was on my own, and a sudden memory popped into my head. We were walking to the pub nearby. There was one of those old brown wooden bus stops. In it was a picture of 2 kids, captioned, "Missing." I didn't get close enough to get a good look at. My dad, without warning, walked over and ripped it from its staples and shoved it in a nearby bin. I was only 7 at the time, so I didn't think anything of it. But after I remembered, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I drove down there a couple weeks ago. I just wanted to have a look, and even if there was nothing, I would just say goodbye to it. When I arrived, though, I was surprised to see that the cabin was gone. All that was left was a couple charred posts. I could smell something rancid, under the smell of wood smoke. "What are you doing here?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. An old man leered at me. "Oh. My parents used to own this place. Or what's left of it. My dad died recently and I thought I should dash." Before I had time to finish my sentence, the old man grunted and barged past me. "You should leave," he growled. "Before you find anything you don't want to." "Weirdo," I muttered under my breath. I had a look at the ruins. They looked like they'd burned recently, but most of the people who owned these places had died or moved away, so it was probably just some gas that was left on or something. There wasn't room for rural living in the world of big cities anymore. I was about to leave, when I felt something deep within me, telling me to look behind, in the woods behind the cabin. I trudged around the ruins and into the forest. The rancid smell got worse the further into the woods I got. I would find the truth about my dad, or I would die trying. I followed it further. I don't know why. I should have turned back. When I found them, I literally retched from the smell. There were at least 24 of them, burned, mutilated corpses, hanging from the branches on nooses. There was no noticeable pattern. They were young, old, all races, men and women. All of them still had their clothes on. Some of them looked like they had been killed recently, some looked decades old. I told you you should have left, growled a voice behind me. I whipped round. The old man was brandishing a shovel, a twisted sneer on his face. Me and your old man, we were quite the pair. I looked at him, horrified. My father did this? I said. A single tear rolled down my cheek. He chuckled. We got away with all of this. No one would expect two middle-class mugs living in this expensive poverty shithole to be mass murderers. He gripped the shovel with both hands. I'm getting old, but I still have time for one more kill. I always hated you. He swung it at me with surprising force. I ducked and white-hot anger boiled through my veins. I charged at the old man, but he dodged out of the way. I was momentarily stunned by his athleticism. He thrusted the shovel towards me like a spear. I grabbed the sides and he kicked my knee, knocking me down. I felt the blade of the shovel digging into my hands, cutting me. I gritted my teeth. The old man grinned sadistically. Lights out, kid. Say hi to your dad from me. I closed my eyes and turned away, awaiting my death, but it never came. I heard two impossibly loud bangs. I opened my eyes. My mother was standing over the corpse of the old man, now a bloody mess. She was clutching a smoothbore shotgun. Way for a family reunion, huh? She said through a strained smile. Later, in the car, I asked her. Did you know? She looked down. I didn't just know. I helped him. He did the dirty work and I covered over his tracks. One day, I told him I wanted to stop. She choked on her words. I rubbed her back. It's okay, Mum. I'm here. She mustered up the strength to continue. He took a knife, and he tried to kill me. I pushed him and he slipped and hit his head on the kitchen counter. I didn't check to see if he was alive. I just got in the car and drove away. Soon after, my mother confessed, and turned herself in. She got 9 years in prison for being an accomplice to a crime and second-degree murder. I can't stop thinking about that day. I went to therapy, and I tried to drown it with alcohol, but it's forever ingrained into my mind. I still feel sick when I smell wood smoke.